January 14th, 1942. Santa Isabel, Spanish Guinea. The Italian officers had no reason to feel threatened. 12 of them were gathered inside the Santa Isabel casino, drinking freely as the last light faded over the West African coast. The atmosphere was relaxed wine, laughter, the low hum of conversation. Even when 2 German officers joined their table, the mood didn't shift. Why would it? Their ships lay peacefully at anchor just below the balcony, protected by Spanish colonial neutrality, shielded by 6-inch coastal defense guns, and covered, above all, by international law. To the Axis officers, this harbor was untouchable. They were moments away from learning how disastrously wrong they were. The island of Fernando Po sat only 30 kilometers from the West African mainland, a perfect vantage point overlooking Allied shipping lanes from South America and South Africa. For 18 months, the Italian merchant liner Duchessa d'Aosta, 8,500 tons, equipped with an operational radio, had calmly broadcast every Allied convoy movement it observed. Moored beside her were 2 German vessels, the ocean-going tug Licomba and the barge Bibundi, which British intelligence believed formed the core of a covert U-boat resupply network. Under Spanish neutrality, none of these ships could be touched. The harbor's coastal batteries stood ready. International law forbade any act of war in a neutral port. The Italian captain had lived comfortably behind this shield for a year and a half, feeding intelligence to Axis forces. The German officers supervised what London suspected was a refueling and rearming point for submarines hunting Allied shipping. Every night, the town generator shut down at precisely 23:30, briefly plunging the harbor into complete blackout before auxiliary lighting flickered back on. It happened every night. Predictable, comforting, safe. But January 1942 was not a safe month for Britain. U-boats were strangling the lifeline that kept the nation alive. Ships sunk meant less food, less fuel, and a future growing dimmer by the week. 3 Axis vessels sitting unchallenged inside a neutral harbor collecting intelligence and aiding submarines posed a threat London could no longer ignore. Winston Churchill reviewed the intelligence. He studied the maps. And then, ignoring every legal and diplomatic obstacle, he made his choice. Neutrality would not save these ships, nor would international law. On November 20th, 1941, the Admiralty approved an operation that risked outrage from Spain, condemnation from the world, and potentially the closure of the Strait of Gibraltar. It didn't matter. The ships had to be removed. And so began a plan that would drag 32 men into one of the boldest acts of piracy of the entire war, an operation that would happen in darkness, under the noses of their enemies, and in defiance of every rule meant to prevent exactly this. The mission would be handed to the only British unit designed for operations that were never meant to appear on official records, the small-scale raiding force. No. 62 Commando Churchill's chosen instrument for what he called ungentlemanly warfare. These were the men trained for the shadows, silent killing, amphibious assault, night boarding, and the kind of precision operations regular forces would not attempt. At the center stood Major Gustavus Henry March-Phillipps, 33 years old, the man who made the impossible feel routine. A Dunkirk veteran and founder of the unit, he had personally sailed their converted 65-ton trawler, Maid Honor, from Poole to West Africa. 6 weeks at sea had brought him to Freetown on September 20th, 1941. 4 months later, he would lead the Fernando Po raid. 8 months after that, he would die on a beach in occupied France. He lived like a man racing a clock no one else could hear. Beside him was Captain Geoffrey Appleyard, 25, the engineer who could turn chaos into order. A Cambridge standout and international skier, he had met March-Phillipps at Dunkirk and joined the Commandos soon after. He already held a military cross before Postmaster began. Within 18 months, he would simply vanish his aircraft, disappearing over the Mediterranean, never recovered. The second raiding party was led by Captain Graham Hayes, 27, a seafarer with a nerve of steel. He would earn the military cross for this operation, survive long enough to escape into Spain, and still be betrayed, captured, held in solitary confinement, and executed by firing squad in July 1943. He was 28, and among them operated the most striking figure of all, Anders Lassen, 21, the quiet Viking built for war. A Danish sailor who joined British forces after his homeland fell in 1940, he moved with a calm intensity that unnerved friend and foe alike. On the night of the raid, he would be the first man up the ladder aboard the Italian liner, an action that earned him both a battlefield commission and the Military Cross. He would later become the only non-Commonwealth recipient of the Victoria Cross in the entire Second World War, killed in Italy just weeks before Germany's surrender. These were the personalities behind the operation. 32 men, in total 11 commandos, 4 SOE agents, and 17 Nigerian sailors to crew the tugboats. The entire small-scale raiding force never exceeded 55 men, yet they trained with an intensity that exceeded their size. Night navigation, explosives, unarmed combat, boarding drills at sea, every role rehearsed, every second accounted for. But while the Commandos shaped themselves into a raiding weapon in England, the SOE was already fighting the silent war on Fernando Po. Leonard Guise began surveillance missions in August 1941, tracking ship routines and harbor patterns. His intelligence built the framework of the operation, but only from the shoreline. What British planners needed was someone inside the Axis circle. That man was Richard Lippett, the infiltrator who lived among those he would later rob. Disguised as an employee of a Liverpool shipping company, he blended perfectly into the island's colonial life. Over months he attended social gatherings, drank with Italian and German officers, studied watch rotations, assessed readiness, and learned who slept ashore. On January 6th, 1942, the very day London finally approved the mission he was aboard, Duchessa d'Aosta, sharing wine with the officers who would lose her 8 nights later. And then came the boldest intelligence play of all. SOE operatives had secretly filmed the pro-German Spanish governor in a compromising situation with his mistress. With that leverage, they extracted permission for tourist flights over Santa Isabel flights that were, in reality, covert aerial reconnaissance missions. The governor, terrified of scandal, complied fully. Spanish authorities unknowingly delivered the British precise aerial photographs of every ship's position, the pattern of coastal defenses, and most importantly, the routine of the town's generator. Every night at exactly 23:30, the power cut out. For several minutes, the harbor lay in absolute darkness before backup lights engaged. This became the fulcrum of the operation, the window on which the entire plan would pivot. 30 minutes of the darkest night. 30 minutes to seize 3 ships and escape under the guns of a neutral port. The countdown had begun. January 11th, 1942. 2 tugboats slipped out of Lagos. Vulcan, the larger of the pair, and Nunian, her smaller companion. Both had been quietly borrowed from the governor of Nigeria. Aboard them were the 32 men who would attempt the impossible. For 3 days at sea, the Commandos practiced the same sequence again and again, launching full-bot canoes, climbing boarding ladders, moving across simulated decks in silence. Captain Graham Hayes drilled them mercilessly. Every man knew his role, every movement rehearsed until it felt automatic. But the real fight would begin on land. The dinner trap. As the tugs approached Fernando Po, Richard Lippett executed the most elegant deception of the operation. He arranged a lavish dinner at the Santa Isabel casino for the night of January 14th, a gathering his Axis acquaintances would never decline. 12 Italian officers from Duchessa d'Aosta arrived first. 2 German officers from Licomba joined them soon after. Lippett positioned their seats carefully, backs turned toward the harbor windows. Wine flowed. Conversation warmed. And just outside, a harbor that looked tranquil was seconds away from erupting into chaos. Not one of the officers realized they were dining 50 meters from the moment their ships would disappear. Into the darkness, At 23:15, Vulcan drifted into position just outside the harbor entrance. The commandos checked their weapons one final time, grappling hooks, scaling ladders, demolition charges, everything laid out with surgical precision. Then the clock hit 23:30. The generator cut out. The lights died. Santa Isabel was swallowed by darkness. The two tugboats slid forward, silent silhouettes against a black sea. Boarding the Italian liner, Vulcan made straight for the towering outline of Duchessa d'Aosta. A few Italian crewmen noticed the approaching craft and flashed a torch toward her but took no further action. In a neutral harbor at night, a small vessel meant nothing, perhaps a supply run, perhaps a messenger from shore. They never suspected what was coming. The 8,500-ton liner sat quietly, leaderless. Officers ashore, crew scattered or asleep. The commandos scaled her hull like shadows. Lassen was first up, swift, silent, brutal in his efficiency. Within seconds, 11 men were aboard. Below decks, confused crewmen surrendered immediately. They had no officers present, no orders, no chance. On the foredeck, another team planted explosive charges onto the massive anchor chains, each link weighing dozens of kilograms. If the commandos were going to steal an 8,500-ton ship, they would first have to free her. The German vessels. Meanwhile, Nuneaton glided toward the German tug and barge moored together. Hayes led his men in full-boat canoes, paddling in total silence. A German watchman on Bibundi called out into the darkness. Hayes answered by claiming to be the ship's captain returning aboard. In the blackout, confused and half-blinded, the watchman let them approach. The moment Hayes' team reached the deck, the two-man watch crew panicked and jumped straight overboard, swimming for shore rather than fight. The German vessels were taken without a single struggle. Explosive charges were fixed to their anchor chains. Tow lines were set. Everything moved with mechanical precision. The harbor erupts. Back in the casino, the wine continued to pour. Lippet kept the dinner lively, offering toasts and stories. None of the Italian or German officers turned toward the windows. Why would they? The room was warm, the drinks ample, the conversation pleasant. And below them, their ships were being stolen in the dark. Then came the moment. All three sets of explosive charges detonated. A rolling boom echoed across the harbor as the chains shattered, massive steel links sheared clean by the blasts. Immediately, Spanish anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. Believing the explosions were the start of an air raid, the gunners filled the sky with tracer rounds. No one understood what was really happening. The 6-inch coastal guns stayed silent, unsure of the target, unsure of the threat. But the window was open. The escape. Vulcan strained under the enormous pull of the Italian liner. Her engines groaned. Her decks trembled. But Duchessa d'Aosta began to move slowly, then with gathering momentum toward the harbor mouth. At the same time, Nuneaton hauled both German vessels together, prisoners secured and tow lines tight. From the pier, Spanish colonial forces gathered in confusion. They saw 3 ships suddenly drifting free, moving toward the sea. They shouted orders, but no one fired. How could they? Were these Italian ships? German ships? British ships? The explosion said, air raid. The movement said, theft. Nothing made sense in the chaos. And so the guns stayed silent. In exactly 30 minutes, under neutral guns and total confusion, 3 Axis ships were stolen. Not one shot fired. Not one British casualty. The most audacious cutting-out operation since the age of sail had just succeeded. The explosions and anti-aircraft fire finally cut through the comfort of the casino. Servants froze. A few officers turned their heads. Then chairs scraped back as drunken Italian and German officers rushed toward the windows. By the time they pushed through the balcony doors, the harbor below was a scene of pure confusion, tracer fire arcing into an empty sky. Spanish gunners shouting contradictory orders, and 3 sets of moorings lying bare. Their ships were gone, vanished into the night. Some officers sprinted downhill toward the piers. Others stumbled in disbelief. The mighty Duchessa d'Aosta, 8,500 tons of Italian pride, was nowhere to be seen. Likomba and Bibundi had simply disappeared. For many, the alcohol made it impossible to grasp what they were witnessing. For others, outrage filled the void faster than comprehension. One German captain, furious and half-drunk, burst into the British consulate demanding his ship back. When the consul professed total ignorance, the German officer threw a punch and had to be restrained by Spanish police. On the waterfront, Spanish dockworkers laughed openly. African laborers grinned from the shadows. To them, it was the most ridiculous and satisfying thing they'd seen in years. The Axis officers had dined 50 meters from their ships while losing all three without firing a shot. Lippet disappears into the night. Richard Lippet quietly paid the casino bill every bottle of wine that softened the Axis officers into complacency and slipped away before anyone connected him to the spectacle unfolding outside. It would take days before Spanish authorities summoned him for questioning. He maintained his innocence with calm precision. A businessman, hosting a dinner party. No idea British commandos had been operating in the harbor. Pure coincidence. With no evidence linking him to the raid, the Spanish released him, though they barred him from leaving the island. On March 1st, 1942, he slipped away in a canoe under cover of darkness, paddled into open water, and escaped to British-controlled territory. The hard part isn't the raid, it's getting home. The 3 captured ships, 1 massive Italian liner and 2 German vessels were now British prizes. But the extraction tested the raiders' seamanship and nerves. On January 15th, both tugboats suffered engine trouble. Nuneaton experienced repeated mechanical failures. Heavy tow lines threatened to snap under strain. The danger hadn't ended with the raid. Mechanical failure, storms, or discovery could still undo everything. Vulcan finally reached her predetermined rendezvous in international waters on January 16th. Waiting there was HMS Violet, a Flower-class corvette sent specifically to stage a legal fiction. The plan was simple and brilliant. British warship finds an Italian vessel drifting at sea. International waters. Perfectly legal. No violation of Spanish neutrality. The choreography was flawless. HMS Violet steamed in, discovered Duchessa d'Aosta, and escorted her toward Lagos, as though the liner had simply been found abandoned. Nuneaton, struggling with mechanical failure, was unable to reach port under her own power. A Nigerian collier sent a distress message on her behalf, allowing a rescue ship to tow both German vessels to safety, another stroke of luck that fit neatly into the cover story. Every step reinforced the illusion. Tugboats helping disabled Axis vessels. A corvette responding to a drifting ship. No mention of commandos, explosives, or raids. The cover story goes global. The moment the ships were secured, the political machine activated. Ian Fleming, then serving as Naval Intelligence Liaison, had already written draft press releases before the raid even began. The Admiralty published the first communiqué. No British or Allied vessels were in the vicinity of Fernando Po, none whatsoever. Then, as Axis accusations began trickling out, the Admiralty issued the second phase. A large, unidentified ship had been sighted in international waters. British patrols were dispatched to investigate. Nothing more could be confirmed. Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden echoed the denials with flawless diplomacy. The deception was so tight that even Britain's own chiefs of staff were left in the dark. They only learned of the operation on January 18th, 4 days after it had happened, and even then were told the ships had been intercepted on the high seas. The truth was kept within a circle so small it barely existed. Spain explodes, but can't act. When news reached Madrid, Spanish Foreign Minister Ramón Serrano Suñer, Franco's powerful brother-in-law and an ardent admirer of Hitler, erupted with fury. His statement thundered across Spain. An intolerable attack on our sovereignty. An act of piracy committed within waters under Spanish jurisdiction. Do not be surprised if we respond as the case demands. With arms. German radio repeated the accusation with feverish anger. British destroyer. Depth charges. Murdered crew. A blatant act of war. Germany and Italy demanded Spain retaliate. Diplomatic protests flooded London. International law had been violated in plain sight. But behind the bluster was a truth no Axis diplomat dared admit. Spain could do nothing. Crippled from civil war, dependent on Allied trade, and militarily weak, Spain had no realistic way to fight Britain. The threats were real, the outrage was genuine, but the consequence was nothing. A storm that slowly dissolved. As the months passed, Spanish policy shifted with the changing tide of war. Allied victories in North Africa weakened pro-Axis voices. In September 1942, Suñer was removed from his post. By October 1943, Spain formally returned to vigilant neutrality. By May 1944, Franco's government quietly signed agreements limiting tungsten exports to Germany and expelling German agents. The diplomatic firestorm that threatened to ignite into a regional crisis simply faded. Operation Postmaster had done its job, and Britain had walked away clean. Once the political smoke began to clear, Britain finally revealed what it had gained. Duchessa d'Aosta, the Italian liner that had sat in Santa Isabel for 18 months, was towed to Greenock, Scotland. Managed by the Canadian Pacific Steamship Company under the name Empire Yukon, she sailed in Allied convoys for the rest of the war. Her cargo, once catalogued, revealed an unexpected treasure trove: 1,340 tons of wool, 141 tons of hides and skins, 580 tons of tanning materials, 1,786 tons of copper, 243 tons of crude asbestos fiber, 1.1 million copper ingots. The first page of the manifest was missing. British intelligence suspected concealed arms or ammunition cargo never declared to Spanish authorities. After the war, the ship passed between owners and names Pet Connie in 1947, Luo in 1951, before being scrapped in Italy in 1952. Le Combe, the German tug, was renamed Malicite in 1947 and sold a year later to Liberian owners. Her final fate was never recorded. Bibundi, the German barge, briefly entered Allied service, but her own records faded into obscurity. Their value on paper varied, but their strategic value was far greater. The destruction of the Italian liner's radio silenced a pipeline of convoy intelligence. The removal of the German vessels disrupted a suspected U-boat resupply chain. 29 captured crewmen became interrogation assets. British analysts gained new insight into Axis maritime logistics through neutral ports. Operation Postmaster had achieved far more than the theft of 3 ships, a victory that validated special operations. For the Special Operations Executive, the shadow organization Churchill demanded for ungentlemanly warfare, Postmaster was proof of concept. Hugh Dalton, the minister overseeing SOE, briefed Churchill personally. His message was clear. Special operations could achieve strategic results where conventional forces could not. Neutrality could be penetrated. Diplomatic protections could be circumvented. With enough deception, political obstacles could be dissolved. The SOE Africa station summarized the lesson succinctly. Perhaps next time, it will not be necessary for prolonged negotiations before undertaking a 30-minute operation. 18 months of preparation, 30 minutes of action, a result that rippled across the war. And then came the cost. Recognition was swift. Major March-Phillipps received the Distinguished Service Order, July 24th, 1942. Captain Hayes earned the Military Cross. Captain Appleyard received a bar to his MC, and later a Distinguished Service Order, December 15th, 1942. Anders Lassen was commissioned as a second lieutenant and awarded the Military Cross for being the first aboard Duchessa d'Aosta. Lassen would later earn 2 more bars to that medal before receiving the Victoria Cross posthumously in 1945. Even the intelligence officers received honors. Richard Lippett, member of the Order of the British Empire. Leonard Geese, member of the Order of the British Empire. But triumph always carries a price. And within 18 months, nearly all the principal leaders were dead. On September 12, 1942, Operation Aquatint, a raid on the French coast, killed March-Phillipps. Hayes evaded capture for 9 months before being betrayed, held in solitary confinement, and executed by firing squad. Appleyard disappeared over the Mediterranean during the Allied invasion of Sicily. Lasson was killed on April 9, 1945, during operations near Lake Comacchio, Italy. King George VI greeted Appleyard at his 3rd decoration ceremony with a dry remark. "What, you again?" It was the last time Appleyard would ever be seen alive. The men who proved that ungentlemanly warfare could change the course of a campaign never lived to see the peace they helped secure. From Fernando Po to fiction. Among the few who witnessed the operation from the intelligence side was Ian Fleming, Naval Intelligence Liaison to SOE. He knew March-Phillipps personally, worked closely with Appleyard, studied Lasson's fearless efficiency, and crafted the deception machinery that protected the entire operation. In SOE terminology, the raiders operated under W prefixed agent codes. March-Phillipps was W1. Appleyard was W2. The W denoted one thing: license to kill. Historians have long noted that Fleming folded these experiences into his later fiction. Bond's F's prefix, colonial and Caribbean settings reminiscent of West Africa. Elaborate deception plots. Intelligence manipulation. Hybrid operations blending stealth, charm, and brutality. Operation Postmaster didn't just influence special operations, it helped inspire James Bond. What the Axis learned. The raid's impact wasn't just strategic or political, it was psychological. If 3 ships could be stolen from a Spanish colonial harbor protected by coastal guns and international law, then no neutral port could guarantee safety. German and Italian records captured the humiliation. Watchmen who jumped overboard rather than fight. Officers who drank wine while their ships vanished. Crews who surrendered without resistance. Diplomats who demanded retaliation Spain could not deliver. Germany's propaganda machine raged for weeks. Spain threatened war, but nothing happened. The reality was inescapable. Britain had reached into a neutral harbor and taken what it wanted. The template for modern special operations. 18 months of intelligence preparation. A deception campaign involving employment covers, blackmail, aerial recon, and pre-written propaganda. A 30-minute raid. Plausible deniability. Minimal force. Maximum effect. This structure, intelligence-heavy, action-light, became the blueprint for modern special operations doctrine. It influenced Operation Creek. Go. 1943. Later, SOE missions across Europe and Africa. Post-war SAS doctrine. Cold War covert operations. And even 21st century Special Forces methodology. Small-scale raiding force would be dissolved in April 1943. Its surviving members helped form the nucleus of the 2nd Special Air Service Regiment. Their DNA, intelligence, precision, deception, audacity lives on. The final echo. Santa Isabel eventually returned to its quiet routine. Broken anchor chains were hauled from the harbor floor. Spanish officials filed furious reports to Madrid. German and Italian officers lodged formal complaints. But the threat was gone. The intelligence network was dismantled. The suspected U-boat supply line severed. The convoy watcher silenced. London judged the operation a total success. Churchill himself read the report with satisfaction. He had gambled on Spain's restraint, on deniability, on the courage of 32 men. And he had been right. Because on that night, in exactly 30 minutes, those men proved a simple truth. Neutral waters offer no protection against determination. Coastal guns and international law cannot stop an idea whose time has come. And for the Axis officers who stumbled back to the harbor at dawn, listening to the laughter of locals and staring at empty moorings, there was no comfort. The wine they had enjoyed was paid for by British intelligence. The dinner was a trap. The ships were gone. The humiliation complete. Operation Postmaster wasn't just a raid. It was a message that crossed oceans. Britain would take what it needed, even from the places the Axis believed were untouchable.